Imagine cruising down a quiet city street in a gleaming luxury car, the hum of the engine almost like a melody of success. You're a doctor, a healer, a helper, on your way home after a long day saving lives. But suddenly, flashing red and blue lights appear in your rearview mirror, and your heart skips a beat. The police are pulling you over. You glance at your reflection, wondering what could possibly be the issue. There's no speeding, no illegal turns, nothing. Yet here they are, signaling you to stop. As you roll down the window, the officer's tone is sharp, their words laced with an unsettling edge. The questions come fast and pointed. Whose car is this? Where are you going? Do you even belong in this neighborhood? You try to remain calm, politely explaining that you're on your way home from work. But the skepticism in their eyes is clear. They don't see a doctor or a hardworking individual. They see something else entirely. Little do they know, the man they're interrogating isn't just a successful doctor. He's the owner of the very hospital that serves their community, the place where lives are saved every day. The irony? Some of these officers might have even walked through its doors themselves, relying on the care and compassion of his team. But at this moment, all they see is a man in an expensive car who, in their minds, doesn't fit the part. Tensions rise as the officers dig deeper, their questions turning into assumptions. The doctor, composed but frustrated, wonders if this is about more than just a traffic stop. Is it about judgment, appearance, something deeper? As the confrontation unfolds, the doctor faces a choice. Does he reveal who he truly is and challenge their assumptions? Or does he let the moment pass, leaving them in the dark about the man they stopped? Stay tuned to see how this story unfolds. What happens next will not only change the officer's perspective, but might just leave you questioning the way we judge others based on surface impressions. The air hung heavy as the doctor sat quietly in his car, hands resting calmly on the wheel. But inside, his mind raced. This wasn't the first time he'd felt judged for his success. An immigrant son who'd worked tirelessly to build a life most people only dream of. Every sleepless night, every extra shift, every ounce of effort he poured into his career had led to this moment. A luxury car, a prestigious title, and the ability to give back to his community. Yet here he was, treated like a stranger in the very city where his hospital stood as a beacon of hope. Outside, the officers continued their scrutiny, walking around his car, murmuring to one another. Their eyes, filled with suspicion, scanned every inch of the vehicle, as if expecting to find some hidden clue to confirm their assumptions. The doctor watched them, his jaw tightening. He thought about his patients, the lives he'd touched, and the lives he'd saved. Did none of that matter? Did the car he drove or the clothes he wore overshadow everything he'd worked so hard to achieve? The officer returned, his demeanor unchanged. License and registration, he demanded, the tone clipped and formal. The doctor handed them over without a word, his expression calm but unreadable. As the officer walked back to his cruiser to run the details, the doctor glanced at the clock on the dashboard. His daughter was waiting for him at home, probably wondering why her dad wasn't there yet to help with her school project. He sighed, his thoughts drifting to his family. They were his reason for everything, his drive to succeed. But moments like these reminded him of how easily appearances could overshadow a person's true character. Inside the police car, the officers were talking. He says he's a doctor, one of them remarked, sounding unconvinced. What kind of doctor drives a car like that? The other chuckled. Maybe he's not a doctor at all. Let's see what comes up when we run these. Back in his car, the doctor adjusted his rearview mirror and looked at his own reflection. He wasn't angry, just tired. Tired of the assumptions, the questions, the constant need to prove himself. But what the officers were about to discover would force them to confront their own biases. And as they walked back toward his car, their faces already hinted at a shift, a small crack in their certainty. As the officers returned, their footsteps slow and deliberate, the doctor could sense the weight of the moment growing heavier. The one who had taken his documents leaned down to the window, a hint of hesitation now creeping into his voice. "So you're a doctor, huh?" he asked, though it sounded less like a question and more like an effort to piece things together. "Yes," the doctor replied, keeping his tone even. "I'm a doctor. I just finished my shift at the hospital." He paused, watching their reactions closely. "The hospital I own." The words hung in the air like a sudden gust of wind. The officer's expression faltered, but only for a second. "Own?" he echoed, as if the idea itself was implausible. His partner shifted uneasily, glancing at the luxury car as though seeing it in a different light. Still, doubt lingered in their eyes, and the doctor knew they weren't ready to let go of their assumptions. Meanwhile, a small crowd had begun to gather a short distance away. Passers-by, curious about the commotion, whispered among themselves, their expressions a mix of concern and intrigue. The sight of the flashing lights and the sleek car had drawn attention, adding another layer of tension to the scene. The doctor felt the weight of their stares, a reminder of how public moments like these could quickly spiral into something much bigger. "I've worked hard for everything I have," the doctor said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now, a quiet strength that refused to be dismissed. "But it seems that no matter what I do, people only see what they want to see." The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he handed back the documents, his gaze searching the doctor's face, as though trying to reconcile the man in front of him with the narrative he'd built in his mind. His partner stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Look, we're just doing our job," he said, though the words felt hollow. "We've got to ask questions when something seems off." "Off," the doctor repeated, his brow furrowing. "Tell me, what exactly about me seems off to you?" The question hung unanswered, the tension crackling like static. Nearby, someone pulled out a phone, recording the exchange. The officers noticed but said nothing, their unease growing. They were trapped now, caught between their assumptions, and the reality slowly unraveling before them. The silence between the doctor and the officers felt louder than the faint hum of the police car engine. Every second stretched into an eternity as the doctor held their gaze, waiting for an answer to his question. The crowd had grown larger now, murmurs rippling through the onlookers like waves. Phones were out, recording every moment, every expression. The officers shifted on their feet, aware that their every move was under scrutiny. One of the officers cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "We're just following protocol," he said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had earlier. His partner, less composed, muttered, "It's not every day we see someone like you in a car like this." The doctor's eyes narrowed slightly, catching the unspoken implication. "Someone like me?" he repeated, his voice calm but firm. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Before the officer could respond, a voice called out from the crowd. "That's Dr. Patel." The doctor turned toward the source, recognizing a nurse from his hospital, pushing her way to the front. "He's the one who funded the new ICU wing," she said, her tone tinged with disbelief. "What are you guys even stopping him for?" The officers glanced at each other, their confidence visibly shaken. The murmurs among the crowd grew louder, voices rising in support of the doctor. People began sharing their own stories, how he had saved their lives, cared for their families, or funded local health initiatives. The tension that had initially surrounded the doctor began to shift, now directed toward the officers themselves. The doctor remained silent, letting the voices of the crowd speak for him. For the first time, the officers seemed to realize they had miscalculated. But instead of backing down, one of them doubled down, crossing his arms defensively. "We're just making sure everything checks out," he said, though the words sounded more like an excuse than a reason. At that moment, another car pulled up, a sleek black sedan bearing the hospital's logo. A man in a sharp suit stepped out, his demeanor commanding immediate attention. It was the hospital's legal advisor, sent by the doctor's assistant after hearing about the incident. "Officers," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos, "is there a problem here?" The officers hesitated, caught off guard. The crowd went quiet, everyone holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The air felt electric, the tension almost unbearable, as the moment teetered on the edge of resolution. The legal advisor's presence commanded silence, his sharp gaze moving between the officers and the doctor. "I trust there's a valid reason for this stop?" he asked, his tone measured but carrying a weight that demanded an answer. The officers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence now a shadow of what it had been. "We were just running routine checks," one of them said, though the words faltered under the weight of the moment. The advisor raised an eyebrow. "Routine checks?" he repeated, glancing at the doctor's car, the growing crowd, and the phones capturing every second. "Interesting choice for a routine stop, considering Dr. Patel's reputation and the fact that he's on his way home after saving lives." The tension seemed to ripple outward, pressing against everyone present. But just as the officers looked ready to back down, a voice crackled over their radios. "We have a report of a vehicle matching this description involved in a nearby incident," the dispatcher said, cutting through the air like a knife. The officers exchanged glances, their faces now a mix of relief and confusion. "See," one of them said, addressing the crowd. "We're doing our job." The crowd's mood shifted again, the whispers growing louder. The doctor furrowed his brow, confusion etched on his face. "What incident?" he asked, his calm beginning to waver. The officers didn't answer immediately, instead focusing on their radios as more details came through. "Luxury car, dark gray, spotted near the scene," the dispatcher continued. "Possible involvement in theft." The crowd erupted in protest, voices overlapping as people defended the doctor. "That's ridiculous," one person shouted. "He's a doctor, not a criminal." But the officers, emboldened by the radio call, stepped forward again. "We'll need to ask you to step out of the vehicle," one of them said, their tone more authoritative now. The doctor's eyes narrowed, his mind racing. He knew this had gone beyond mistaken identity. Something deeper was at play. But before he could respond, the legal advisor interjected. "Hold on," he said, his voice sharp. "Are you accusing my client of a crime without evidence?" The officers hesitated, but their hands were tied by the dispatcher's call. The doctor exhaled slowly, his frustration mounting as he stepped out of the car. The crowd closed in, the tension reaching a fever pitch. And as the officers prepared to search the vehicle, the doctor turned to his advisor. "This isn't just about a car," he said quietly. "Someone's trying to set me up." The doctor stood by his car, his hands steady but his mind racing. The crowd watched in tense silence as the officers prepared to search the vehicle. The legal advisor, calm yet firm, kept close, his phone out and recording everything. "You're making a mistake," he said, his tone a warning. "If there's nothing here, you'll be held accountable for this baseless escalation." One of the officers ignored him and opened the car door, methodically searching the interior. The doctor kept his eyes on them, his chest tightening with every passing second. He knew there was nothing illegal in the car, but the accusation itself was enough to damage his reputation, especially in an era where public perception could shift with a single viral clip. As the officer searched, a commotion erupted from the back of the crowd. A young man in a hoodie, breathless and panicked, tried to slip away unnoticed. "Hey," someone yelled, pointing at him. "Isn't that the guy who ran from the scene earlier?" All eyes turned to the man, who froze for a moment before bolting. Without hesitation, the second officer took off after him, weaving through the crowd. The doctor watched, his stomach sinking as realization began to dawn. This wasn't about his car. It was about a crime he had no part in, and the real suspect had been lurking nearby the entire time. Within moments, the fleeing man was apprehended and brought back to the scene. The crowd erupted in disbelief and frustration as the truth began to unravel. The officers looked stunned, their earlier confidence replaced by embarrassment. The legal advisor seized the moment, his voice cutting through the chaos. "This entire incident could have been avoided if you hadn't jumped to conclusions," he said, addressing the officers. "You profiled a man based on the car he drove instead of focusing on real evidence." The lead officer, clearly shaken, turned to the doctor. "We apologize for the misunderstanding," he said, his voice barely audible. But the doctor didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned to the crowd, his voice calm but resolute. "This isn't just about me," he said. "This is about the assumptions we make and how quickly they can lead to injustice." As the crowd began to disperse, the doctor glanced at his advisor. "A setup," he said again, more to himself than anyone else. But this time, it wasn't the young man he was thinking about. There was someone else behind this, a bigger force at play. And though the immediate danger was over, the real story was only just beginning. As the young man was escorted away, the weight of the moment settled over the scene. The crowd, once vocal and charged, began to thin out, murmuring about the injustice they had witnessed. The doctor stood beside his car, his composure unwavering, but his thoughts swirling. He had just been through a moment that could have unraveled years of hard work and dedication, all because of a single assumption. The lead officer approached him again, visibly humbled. "We got it wrong," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "We were too quick to judge, and for that I'm sorry." The doctor studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Apologies are a start," he replied, "but it's the actions after this that matter. How many others have faced what I did tonight without a crowd to defend them or a legal advisor to back them up?" The officer seemed to take in the weight of the words, nodding slowly before returning to his cruiser. The doctor turned to his legal advisor, who was already making notes on his phone. "This isn't over," the advisor said firmly. "The community needs to know what happened here, and the system needs to be held accountable." The doctor nodded, but his focus shifted to the larger question lingering in his mind. Who had really orchestrated this? The young man's involvement seemed too coincidental, and the timing of the incident, targeting his car specifically, felt deliberate. But for now, those answers would have to wait. Later that evening, the doctor finally made it home. His daughter ran to the door, throwing her arms around him. "You're late," she said, her voice tinged with concern. He hugged her tightly, grateful to be back with his family. Sitting down at the dinner table, he reflected on the events of the day. It wasn't just about him. It was a stark reminder of how biases and assumptions could impact anyone, no matter their status or achievements. As the night wore on, he drafted a statement to share his experience with the world, determined to turn the incident into a teachable moment. He didn't want anger to be the takeaway. Instead, he wanted change, real, meaningful change that could prevent someone else from going through the same ordeal. The doctor leaned back, a sense of calm washing over him. This chapter had ended, but a new mission had begun. And this time, he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who deserved to be seen for who they truly were.